Chapter 11. Bulls in China Shops. By the time I returned to Hackney in 1990, major changes had taken place in the running of London schools. One dark and dismal night in 1988, a pair of political villains had rushed a piece of legislation through the House of Commons while no one was looking. Like masked assassins, Heseltine and Tebbit, for it was they, had secretly murdered the Inner London Education Authority. The 8 small boroughs of London were now to run their own education services. The people of London had not been consulted. We, the residents, already knew that Hackney couldn't manage its housing, its rubbish collection, its libraries or its leisure facilities. Now the futures of 25,000 largely deprived children from one of the poorest areas in Europe were to be placed in the council's inexperienced and inexpert hands. I do not suppose that Messrs. Tebbit and Heseltine, now sitting in the House of Lords, have done anything other than congratulate themselves on their political coup. Yet the people of Hackney lived with the chaos and the waste for years after. In 2004, 50% of Hackney's schoolchildren had to seek their secondary education elsewhere. There was only one mixed non-sectarian secondary school left in the borough. In 1984 there had been 6. By 2016 there were 6 once again. Hackney Council, deprived of funds by the government, now had to raid education to plug holes in its budget. It had inherited from the ILEA a wealth of Victorian buildings that had been set aside for educational purposes, including 3 residential special schools in the countryside. These schools were a real haven for children of damaged backgrounds. In 1989 they were transferred to Hackney Education. By the year 2000 they had all been sold. Most of the children had been integrated, for better or worse, into mainstream education. School buildings within Hackney were also sold off wherever possible. In Tottenham Road near Dalston you'll see 2 Victorian buildings, one of which is still used as a school. The smaller of the 2 was known as de Beauvoir Infant School. In 1993, impressed with its head teacher, my wife and I decided to send our boy there. Some years later, my wife worked there as a teacher. In 1998, the infants were rehoused in the junior school building and the infants building was left empty. In October of that year, Hackney was reshuffling its sites and the Hackney School study collection, of which I was then the teacher manager, was unceremoniously dumped at a week's notice into the old de Beauvoir Infants buildings. The study collection was a huge collection of artefacts that belonged to Hackney schools, which were borrowed by the teachers for use in class. So, for the next 9 months, I managed the collection from there. During that year, my daughter also attended de Beauvoir Infants School. Thus, it happened that my entire family had worked in an educational context at one time or another in this Victorian building. At the end of the year, the Hackney Advisory Service was privatised. The study collection was given away en bloc to Islington, and I was made redundant. De Beauvoir Infant School, although originally designated for educational purposes, was sold off to pay for further holes in the council's budget. It has since been turned into flats for young, prosperous city entrepreneurs. In the year 2000, after a spell in the United States, I returned to teach at Kingsland School. In theory, Kingsland was a mixed school, but the girls were few in number. It was dominated by rumbustious, raucous boys who had arrived for class like a rugger scrum driving over for a try. It had never been an easy school to control. There were 4 teaching blocks, and the pupils roamed from block to block between the lessons. There were plenty of hiding places where drugs could be exchanged and scores could be settled. 13 full-time posts were unfilled throughout that term. Supply teachers came and went in a day, vowing never to return. I was asked to take over classes from teachers who had been locked in cupboards, been attacked and wounded, or who had suffered a nervous breakdown. After a few weeks, I wondered if I was going to make it to the Christmas holidays. My knee collapsed. I knew I had finally been defeated. Ashamed of myself for giving up, I spent the last 2 weeks of term convalescing. It was then 25 years since I had first taught at Kingsland School, then Dorster Mount, see Chapter 6, and to see it in such a state was heartbreaking. No money had been spent on the building since 1980. Roofs were leaking, paint was peeling. Doors and windows were broken, and the 1970s concrete had grey and brown stains streaking the sides of the walls. Yet I knew that this school was not alone in its desperation. It seemed, after 25 years of experiment and change, of great education debates, of a gaggle of education secretaries with their national curricula, SATs, Baker Days, Ofsteds, lesson plans, literacy hours, numeracy hours, teacher assessment, incentive, disincentives, and parental choice in education, that the children of Hackney were learning less than they'd ever done before. The political football that education had become had been kicked around with so much gusto by the politicians that it had finally gone flat. When in doubt and there's no more money, I hear the politicians say, give them choice. It costs nothing. Everybody wants it. And it puts the ball firmly back in the opponent's, that is, the public's, court. Of course, in the long run, it will create hideous sink schools that will become so embarrassing that they will have to be closed, and one day the taxpayer will have to pay for hundreds of brand new schools which will by then be called something fancy like academies. But who cares about one day? Right now we have to win an election, and the word choice will help us do it. It's such a seductive word, choice. Think of chomping into a crisp, ripe strawberry and letting the sweet aromatic juices slip down the throat and over the chin. The word conjures up visions of summertime and plenty. Yes, we all want choice. The rich have always had it. Shall we put him down for Eton or Harrow, dear? Perhaps there was more to the word choice than met the eye. Some politicians may have realised that by selling us the word, they could bring back selection without telling anyone. We do know that in the late 1960s, the Conservative Party was strongly opposed to the idea of comprehensives and equality of opportunity in education. They produced a black paper maintaining that selection was the only sensible way to organise education. By the time Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1979, the comprehensive system was up and running, and it would have been impossible to go back to what had been. That is, until someone in her government came up with the solution, choice. Costing nothing, it would destroy the comprehensive system at a stroke without even having to confess to that aim. The Labour government of 1997 continued the policy as it continued most of the Tory policies, ignoring the damage and the long-term cost. The next election was all that mattered. In effect, choice, selection, and the free market in education create a spiral of success for some schools and a spiral of failure for others. If the top school can choose the best raw material, the product of that school will also be the best. Any manufacturer can tell you that. The demand for those top schools will then increase, and the quality of the raw material will improve even more. The reverse is equally true at the other end of the spiral. From 2001 to 2003, I worked in Ipswich, Suffolk, where I was able to see the same process I had seen in London. Unlike Hackney, Ipswich was not then recognised as one of the most deprived areas in Europe, with very high levels of immigration and poverty. Ipswich was a very typical English market town, not as refined as Norwich, but not as depressed as Lowestoft or Hull. I first began to work there in a former grammar school, now a specialist language school. Very nice it was too, with relatively enthusiastic pupils achieving a 70% success rate at GCSE. I also taught in the school down the road, where the pass rate was 19% in 2003. Slightly worse than the bottom of the league in Hackney. The quality of teaching was, in my humble opinion, the same in both Ipswich schools. However, the levels of stress amongst the teachers in the latter were far higher than in the former. Choice meant that one school was bound to collapse. You already know which one that was. In Hackney, the destruction caused by choice was painful and inevitable. Once Hackney Downs Boys' School had lost its sister school at Dalston Mount, few boys were going to pass up the opportunity of being in a school with girls, especially as the new Kingsland School had been pumped with cash to help it over its amalgamation period. In 1982, it boasts the best pupil-teacher ratio and facilities in Hackney. Of course, that was not going to last. Nevertheless, undersubscribed Hackney Downs rapidly became the Sink School, happy to take on extra special needs pupils now that the special schools were closing. Hackney Downs always had room for boys expelled from other schools. By 1994, 60% of the children at Hackney Downs were identified as having special needs. Eventually, after a long and painful struggle, the school was closed at the end of 1995. See Hackney Downs, The School That Dared to Fight, published by Cassell, 1999. Its successor, Mossbourne, takes about 12% of special needs. Somebody had to teach the boys from Hackney Downs. They mostly went to Kingsland or Homerton College of Technology. Kingsland was soon in special measures. It finally closed in 2004. Homerton College of Technology, formerly Upton House, and before that Upton House, went into special measures as well. 3 secondary schools with a total capacity of 3,000 pupils had been destroyed. by the illusion of parental choice. The economic costs were monumental. Simply to close Hackney Downs, the taxpayer paid out nearly £2 million. The government, belatedly realising that someone had to teach the children of Hackney, decided to build new specialist academies, one of them on the old Hackney Downs site. That school was called Mossbourne and was opened in 2004 at a cost of over £30 million. As it happened, in 2005, my daughter was due to go to a secondary, and we were hoping she would go to Stoke Newington School following her brother. Although just outside the catchment area for Mossbourne, my wife was surprised to get a phone call from the head teacher asking if our daughter would like to attend his school. He had checked the local primaries and was scouting for able pupils who were outside the area. In fact, he could select 10% of his intake this way. In any case, under the regulations for academies, 25% would be grammar school intake. This meant that 35% of the intake was top stream. To make sure that nothing went wrong, the head was also able to refuse entry to any pupil who had been excluded more than once from a primary school. He took in fewer children with English as a second language than the other Hackney schools and fewer special needs children. Finally, Mossbourne was the beneficiary of a brand new architect-designed building, 100% backing from the government, a large portrait of Tony Blair hung in reception, and the kind of funding that every other school in Hackney was crying out for. The staffing budget is still 15% higher than the national average. As it turned out, my wife had other plans for our daughter. The head of Mossbourne had shown me that parental choice was in effect selection of the pupil by the school. In 2016, Mrs May's government aims to bring back the grammar schools without even bothering to disguise the policy of selection within an academy programme. The social costs of all these political machinations in education have been equally disastrous. Schools are focal points for communities. For every pupil that became depressed and disillusioned, you can add their families and friends. For every teacher, there were classroom assistants, cleaners, kitchen staff, administrators and caretakers. In the year his school closed, Olufemi Adesina, one of the pupils at Kingsland, wrote a poem about the school describing it thus: "I am the rock and hurricane behind mankind. I am the great Kingsland School." Olufemi's rock is now gone. Some of us have the choice to revisit our old schools, to see the old teachers, to benefit from societies and connections with former school chums. Not so Olufemi and his classmates. For them, Kingsland exists no more. Its memory will be filled with sadness, humiliation, disillusion, and not a little anger. Other Hackney secondary schools that no longer exist are Clissold Park, Shoreditch, South Hackney, Woodbury Down, Edith Cavell, Dalston Mount, Brook House, Upton House and Homerton Technology College. Together with Kingsland and Hackney Downs, 1975 and 2007, roughly 20,000 pupils attended these institutions. You may have wondered during the riots of 2011 why so many young people in Hackney had so little regard for their area, so little sense of social responsibility. The casual destruction of their childhood may be part of the answer. The following YouTube clip explains better than I ever could.